Marriage is one of the most sacred commitments a person can make. It's not just a legal contract or an emotional connection, it's a divine covenant, a bond designed by God to reflect His love, unity, and faithfulness. From the very beginning, God established marriage as a lifelong union between a man and a woman, meant to be a foundation for family stability and spiritual growth. It was never intended to be something temporary or easily broken. When two people stand before God and vow to love each other for better or worse, in sickness and in health, they are making a promise that goes beyond feelings or circumstances. They are committing to mirror the very faithfulness of God Himself. But let's be honest, marriage isn't always easy. Love isn't just about emotions. It's a daily choice, a decision to be patient, to forgive, to serve, and to sacrifice. That's why God designed marriage to be more than just companionship. It's a reflection of His covenant with us. Just as He remains faithful to us despite our shortcomings, He calls us to remain faithful in our marriages, even when things get tough. The world tells us that love is about happiness and personal fulfillment. But God's definition of love goes deeper. It's about commitment, perseverance, and selflessness. When Jesus spoke about marriage, He pointed back to the original design, saying, "What God has joined together, let no one separate." That tells us something powerful. Marriage is God's idea, not ours. He is the one who joins a husband and wife together, and His intent is that they stay together, working through challenges rather than walking away from them. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't real struggles. It doesn't mean there aren't moments of pain, betrayal, or heartache. But it does mean that God sees marriage as something sacred, something worth fighting for. Divorce was never part of God's perfect plan. It exists because we live in a broken world where sin, selfishness, and hardship can tear people apart. But just because something happens doesn't mean it was God's best. He allows divorce in certain situations, not because He wants it, but because He understands the hardness of human hearts. The truth is, God grieves over every broken marriage because it represents something He created for good that has been damaged. That's why before we even ask whether divorce and remarriage are sins, we have to understand the heart of God regarding marriage. His heart is for restoration, not destruction. His heart is for love that endures, not love that fades when tested. And if we truly understand His design for marriage, we won't be asking, how can I get out of this? But rather, how can I honor God through this? Because when we see marriage the way God does, we begin to realize that it's not just about us, it's about reflecting His love, His faithfulness, and His grace to the world. If we're going to talk about divorce and remarriage, we have to start by looking at what God says about it. The Bible is clear that marriage is a covenant, not just a contract. A contract can be broken when one party doesn't hold up their end of the deal, but a covenant is something deeper. It's a sacred promise made before God, one that is meant to last a lifetime. That's why when Jesus was asked about divorce, He pointed people back to the beginning, back to God's original design for marriage. He said, from the beginning, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. Jesus wasn't saying this to be harsh. He was reminding people that marriage is more than just a human arrangement, something God Himself establishes. But then the Pharisees pressed Him, asking, then why did Moses allow divorce? And Jesus gave an answer that reveals something about human nature. He said, Moses permitted divorce because of the hardness of your hearts. But it was not this way from the beginning. In other words, divorce was never part of God's perfect plan. It was something allowed because people's hearts had become hardened, because sin had entered the world and broken what God designed to be whole. Now, does that mean divorce is never allowed? No. The Bible does make some allowances. Jesus mentioned one marital unfaithfulness. In cases of adultery, He recognized that the betrayal of that sacred bond could be so deep that divorce might be a tragic but necessary option. Paul later spoke about another situation when an unbelieving spouse abandons a believer. In such cases, he said, the believer is not bound to that marriage anymore. But here's what's important. Just because Allah allows divorce in certain circumstances doesn't mean God ever takes it lightly. It's never His first choice, never His desire. His heart is always for healing, for reconciliation, for restoration whenever possible. And then there's the question of remarriage. Some people believe that if someone divorces, they can never remarry without being in sin. Others believe that after a biblically allowed divorce, remarriage is permissible. So which is it? This is where we have to balance truth with grace. If someone divorces for unbiblical reasons and rushes into another marriage, they may be stepping outside of God's will. But if someone experiences divorce in circumstances where it was allowed and they have sought God's guidance, then remarriage can be a fresh start. What matters most is the heart. Are we seeking God's will, honoring Him in our relationships, and walking in His grace? Because at the end of the day, God is not just about rules, He's about redemption. And His desire is always to bring healing, not condemnation. If we're going to have an honest conversation about divorce and remarriage, we have to recognize that people haven't always viewed it the same way. Different cultures, different eras, and different traditions have shaped how societies understand marriage, and those views have changed dramatically over time. But here's the thing, God's design for marriage has never changed. What has changed is how people choose to treat it. In ancient times, marriage was often more about survival and alliances than love. Families arranged marriages to secure wealth, land, and power. In some cultures, men had the authority to divorce their wives for almost any reason, while women had little to no say. In the time of Moses, divorce was common, and some men were divorcing their wives for the smallest inconveniences. That's why Moses, under God's direction, gave laws to regulate it, not because God wanted divorce, but because He was protecting people from the chaos of broken marriages. He was setting boundaries so that divorce wouldn't be used as an excuse for selfishness or abuse. Then Jesus came along and He raised the standard. He didn't say divorce is okay if it's convenient. He pointed people back to God's original plan that marriage was meant to be a lifelong covenant, not something to be discarded when things got difficult. That was a radical idea in His time. The religious leaders had been treating divorce like a legal loophole, but Jesus made it clear that marriage was sacred. He wasn't trying to make life harder for people. He was calling them to something higher, something better than what the culture around them had accepted. Fast forward to today, and we see an entirely different cultural landscape. Divorce is more common than ever. And in many places, it's not just accepted, it's expected. If a marriage gets tough, society says, just move on. Find someone new. The idea of lifelong commitment has been replaced with a culture of convenience. And yet, despite all the changes, one thing remains true. When a marriage ends, it always brings pain. No one goes into a marriage expecting it to fail. No one stands at the altar thinking one day we'll break this apart. And yet it happens sometimes because of unfaithfulness, sometimes because of deep wounds, and sometimes simply because people stop trying. So what do we do with all of this? Do we just go along with culture and treat marriage as disposable? Or do we listen to what God has said from the beginning? The truth is, culture will always shift,